question comes from Tracy, and it's a follow-on question to something that I answered last week about the action of actin and myosin inside muscle fibers and the physiological mechanism of how muscles contract. So if you want more background, go back to last week's episode and watch that one. Tracy says, when a muscle is chronically contracted and we have knots in the muscle, does that mean that the actin and myosin filaments get locked together? What causes knots, and how does massage or myofascial release these adhesions or stubborn contractions? Thanks again. Hope all is well in Melbourne. Yeah, everything's pretty awesome here with me at the moment, Tracy. Thanks for asking. There are actually a number of assumptions behind this question which turn out to not be correct. So it's commonly supposed that we get painful knots in our muscles. Sometimes they're called trigger points, sometimes they're called knots, sometimes they're called tender points, and that these are, local contractions of the muscle, and that they can be released by dry needling or massage or rolling on a ball or something. And indeed, when you have a sore spot in your neck or your hip or something, often if you palpate it, you can feel a kind of a taut band of muscle in there. And when you rub on it, it hurts like anything. And then after you rub on it for a bit, it feels better. So that hypothesis does, at face value, seem to fit the facts. The hypothesis being that there's a local contraction or knot, within the muscle, and that you can release that by pressing on it. However, this phenomenon has been pretty extensively researched now, and it's failed to really stand up to that research. So there are several lines of evidence here that I'd like to share with you. The first one, well, basically two big areas. The first one is experimental studies that try and locate trigger points or knots within muscles have essentially failed to do so. And the second one is when we look at intervention studies that look at pressing on or injecting things into or dry needling of these trigger points or muscle knots, those studies essentially have show very minimal benefit, if any, beyond placebo of that treatment. So let me explain in a little bit more detail. So firstly, let's look at or think about some of the research in relation to finding trigger points or muscle knots. So it is true that when you palpate, a sore muscle, often you can feel a kind of a tight spot or a knot or a taut band under your fingers. However, when we look at these in controlled experiments, several things sort of become clearer. The first one is that when you press on a muscle, there's something called the myotatic reflex, which basically causes the muscle to contract due to the pressure. So it's really a case of if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound, because if you're not palpating, well, the taut band could well not be there because it might be an artifact of the palpation. So in other words, the palpation, feeling for the taut band, causes the taut band. So that might be one thing. The second thing is that when we, in studies where they get physiotherapists or, medical people to palpate patients and, feel with their hands and try and feel where these taut bands are, where the trigger points are, when the treating health professional knows, this person's got pain here, then they feel, they go, oh yeah, I can feel the taut band, it's right there. But when they're blinded as to whether the person has pain or not, so in other words, they have a whole bunch of people with neck pain, a bunch of people with no neck pain, and they're treating, medical people have to find the taut bands. It turns out that they basically can't identify them better than a coin flip when they don't know, where the pain is. So they can find taut bands, but they find very different ones. So one study I saw, there was a difference in the upper trapezius muscle, which goes from here to here. Like it's a muscle that's probably, 15 centimetres long. And there was up to 6.5 centimetres difference in where the experienced practitioners found these trigger points or taut bands in this particular study. So, it's just the margin of error is essentially the size of the universe on that one. Now, another phenomenon that is associated with these knots is that when you poke on them, if you have a sore spot, sometimes when you poke on it, the pain radiates to somewhere else. Like if you press on your neck, it might radiate up to your head or down to your shoulder or something. And the interesting thing about this is that it's not just pain that radiates. It's actually pain sensitivity that radiates, or tenderness that radiates. So if you have a painful spot, on your neck somewhere, well, that can radiate pain down to your shoulder sometimes if you press on it. But also what you'll find is that the shoulder is more tender in that instance where there's a radiated pain. There's often also a radiated hypersensitivity. So, and this can be the case in situations where people have, nerve irritation in their low back and their nerve pain, there's nerve-generated pain or sciatica going down the leg. Well, actually, the leg can be super sensitive, like really tender and unpleasant, painful for the person if you touch it. And it's not because there's something wrong in the leg; it's because the nerve that innervates the leg is irritated. And so that's that line of experimental evidence. The increased sensitivity in the like the radiation from the referral from these trigger points or knots, or supposed trigger points or knots, suggests, more plausibly some kind of neural irritation rather than a muscle knot, as it were. When we inject, another line of evidence, when we inject Botox, botulinum toxin A, I think it's called, which basically paralyzes the muscle. When we inject Botox into trigger points, it doesn't reduce the pain, although it does eliminate the muscle activity that's happening. So that, that kind of pulls apart, that disconnects the idea of the muscle tension from the pain, because we can actually eliminate the muscle tension by injecting Botox, but that doesn't eliminate the pain. So if we can eliminate the muscle tension and the pain remains, well, the muscle tension probably wasn't causing the pain. What else have I got in my notes here? Oh, yeah. Studies using ultrasound, MRI and electromyography, so sticking needles into the muscle and measuring the electrical impulse from the muscle, have really failed to detect trigger points, for a number of reasons. And for example, when you do electromyography on someone, you stick a needle into their muscle to measure the electrical activity. Well, that's not just a passive measurement, that's an actual, you're sticking a needle into the muscle, and that can evoke the myotatic reflex. If you stick a needle into a muscle, it can cause the muscle to fire. And so, that inherently confounds the results of these studies. We're trying to detect muscles firing, and we cause them to fire by the detection process. Kind of like what we said at the start, when you press on a muscle, it causes that myotatic reflex. With ultrasound, we can image muscles and sometimes we can detect areas where the muscle's contracted, but it's then hard to connect those areas where the muscle's contracted with areas where the patient feels symptom. Finally, the last line of evidence is that in terms of experimental pathophysiology, is that we find that people who have, so there are supposed to be two forms of trigger point, muscle knot. One is called active and the other one's called latent. And the active trigger points or knots are ones that are actively painful. So you see the thing, gee, my neck hurts, or gee, my back hurts. And, there's a kind of a throb or an ache or whatever from that spot. And then when you press on that spot, it's even more painful. It's very tender and sensitive to touch, and often it radiates to somewhere else. And then there's the latent trigger points, which are not painful. You're walking around happy as Larry, not able to feel any discomfort. But when you press on them, that's really sore. So the latent ones are said to be, knots that are in there as well. But the problem with that hypothesis is that when we examine, palpate, poke people who have active trigger points, we find that they have also latent trigger points in other areas of their body. And then where we find people who have no active trigger points, have no muscular pain ever, they also have latent trigger points in just as many parts of their body. So the latent trigger points seem to be basically everyone has it. If you press in this spot in your neck or just under your head here or in certain places in your lower back, everyone's going to feel that as tender. And then when we actually look at pro-inflammatory chemicals and things so the idea is that the knot in the muscle is contracted, and that prevents adequate blood flow to the muscle because it collapses the capillaries, the smallest blood vessels, and prevents oxygenation of the muscle. So the muscle undergoes oxygen starvation, essentially. It's called ischemia. And then the muscle releases inflammatory chemicals, and that causes the irritation, and which perpetuates the muscle contraction. So that's kind of the theory. But what we find is, so when we actually do muscle biopsies of trigger points or muscle knots, we find pro-inflammatory chemicals there. But then when we do muscle biopsies of the same person, but in a completely different muscle, so maybe if they've got a sore neck, we biopsy their calf muscle that's not sore, or their quad muscle or something that's not sore, we find the exact same level of inflammatory markers in that uninvolved muscle, that asymptomatic muscle. And so what that says is that those in these people for whom they have these active trigger points, so-called, actually it's probably more of a systemic situation of inflammation, and we find that they have increased pressure pain sensitivity and so on, and other forms of pain sensitivity. So it's probably more of a central nervous system processing, or possibly more of a central nervous system processing issue, combined with maybe a neural inflammation. And finally, the last line of evidence is actually experimental studies on interventions. So when we get a bunch of people who have pain, chronic muscle pain, and we dry needle them, or we massage them, or we inject anesthetic into their trigger points or whatever, what we find is basically these interventions have essentially no benefit beyond placebo. So when we do sham dry needling, for example, it's basically just as good as real dry needling. And all of these interventions, so whether you're pressing on a sore spot or whether you're sticking a needle in it, all of these interventions have a common theme, which is they all cause pain, right? If you stick a needle in, that hurts. If you press on somewhere that's sore, that hurts as well. And so basically another theory that might explain this is you basically cause a competing, more painful stimulus, and that essentially drowns out the original pain. And drowns out is not quite the right word, but basically either through central nervous system descending nociceptive inhibition and through pain gating, which are I won't go into the explanation of right now, but basically your brain can't process two different pains in the same area at the same time. So you can't have, you can have a dull throbbing ache and you can have a sharp searing pain, but you can't have both in the same body part at the same time. So if you've got a dull throbbing ache there and I stick a needle in you, well, now you've got a sharp searing pain, so you can't feel the dull throbbing ache anymore. And when you take the pin out, even though the sharp searing ache is gone, your brain's kind of been distracted from that a little bit, and so you don't notice the throbbing pain there for a while. So that's how massage or soft myofascial release or dry needling could alleviate those symptoms temporarily. So we're left with these phenomena that people have, when you palpate, you can feel taut bands in there, and then when you press on, and they have a pain, and then when you press on there for a while and it hurts, the muscle feels like it relaxes. Well, what happens is when you increase the pain, that tends to decrease the muscle activity. So you press on it and you cause it to become taut because you've evoked the myotatic reflex, and then you cause some pain, and that pain tends to relax the muscle and you feel it relax and you're like, oh, that's feeling good. And then you take your hand away and they're like, oh, that feels a lot better. And so an alternative explanation that doesn't have yet strong experimental support, I have to tell you, but is more plausible and, more importantly, has not been disproved like trigger points have. An alternative hypothesis, and probably the best working hypothesis that we have at the moment, is that people have pain of unknown origin in their muscles, possibly central nervous system related or related to inflammation / irritation of peripheral nerves. And when you palpate, that palpation causes the myotatic reflex to evoke a taut band, a knot. So the act of palpation causes the knot, and then when you cause pain, that pain essentially drowns out the other pain. If it's sharp enough, it drowns out the other pain. When you take your finger away, they can't feel the other pain for some time, but eventually it comes back when their brain kind of flips back in. So where does that leave us as practitioners if we like to roll on a ball or massage people or whatever? Well, if I've got a sore neck, I massage it because it feels better. But I just don't think I'm fixing anything in the muscle. I don't think I'm undoing knots or adhesions or trigger points. I just know that if I rub on it for 30 seconds, it feels looser for a bit, and then it often comes back again in full force after a couple of hours. And I know that massage is not a long-term cure or fix or solution for any of these things. It's kind of a short-term feel-good thing, and that for most of these conditions, it's if it's a chronic pain situation, much more contextual in terms of their whole life, things about systemic issues like sleep, stress, negative pain beliefs, passive coping strategies, all of these types of things are probably more important, and physical exercise and physical activity are probably more important than releasing knots in the bit where you feel the pain. So, Tracy, a long and somewhat meandering explanation, but I hope that makes sense. I'm going to attach in the description of this video, under this video, a fantastic paper by Quintner et al. From 2014, which is called A Critical Evaluation of the Trigger Point Phenomenon. And it is a brilliant paper which goes into all of this in much more detail with a lot of citations.